Good afternoon. I'm Rex Buchanan, former director of the Kansas Geological Survey. Today is January 24th, 2024. We're here to interview Roger McCoy for the Kansas Oral History Project. Our videographer is former Representative Dave Heineman. We thank Mr. McCoy for hosting this interview at the McCoy Petroleum office in Wichita, Kansas. Roger McCoy is a native Kansan who grew up on a farm near Spivey, Kansas in Kingman County. He graduated from Attica High School in the mid-1950s and took his first job in the oil industry driving a tank truck during the summer before he started at Wichita State University. Roger graduated from WSU with a bachelor's degree in geology in 1959. Roger's entire career has been in the oil industry. Immediately after graduating from college, he took a job as a staff geologist for Musgrove Petroleum Corporation, working in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. In 1962, he began working as an independent consulting geologist, which he continued doing for over a decade until he founded McCoy Petroleum in 1970. While pursuing his career from 1959 to 61, Roger served in the Kansas Air National Guard, leaving the service at the rank of First Lieutenant Fuels Officer. This interview is part of the Kansas Oral History Project series examining the development of public policy at the nexus of energy and the environment during the late 20th and 21st centuries. In these interviews, we explore those policies through the eyes of experts, executives, administrators, legislators, environmentalists, and others. The Kansas Oral History Project is a nonprofit corporation created to collect and preserve oral histories of Kansans who were involved in shaping and implementing public policy. Recordings and transcripts of those oral history interviews are accessible online at ksoralhistory.org and through the Kansas Historical Society and the State Library of Kansas. Kansas Oral History Project is supported by donations from generous individuals and grants from Evergy and ITC Great Plains. Thank you, Roger, for agreeing to share your insights today and for having us here. And thank you, David, for volunteering your videography skills. So with that, Roger, I appreciate you doing this. One of the things that's real hard to miss with you is what a broad range of jobs you have done in the oil business. You've done a bunch of things. How did you get started down that road?
When I was driving the water truck, we were, of course, at that time, after I got out of high school, I thought I'd be going to Kansas State and probably taking agriculture. And I was fascinated with all the drilling that was going on, the Spivey Grabs area, down into Barber County, clear down into Oklahoma in the Osage band down there. And while I hauled water to several different drilling rigs at that time, there were a lot of rigs running down there. There's probably 25 or 30 rigs running at that time in that area. And the geologist on a well that's so high was drilling south of Medicine Lodge along the Gyp Hills Road. There was a geologist by the name of George McCaleb. And got to talking to him and about what he was doing. He told me he was making $75 a day sitting out there in that little trailer house. I thought, man, there's not that much money in the whole world. So he told me a little bit about, what he did and let me look through his microscope and all that. And I thought, well, this is really fascinating. So he said, he asked me what my plans were, and I said, well, I'm planning to go to Kansas State and study geology, to study agriculture. He said, well, if you're interested in geology, you could probably get a job while you're going to school in Wichita. I said, well, that would even be better. So he encouraged me to look into it, and I did, and I enrolled at Wichita State then, which at that time was the Municipal University of Wichita.
I was going to say in our introduction it was referred to as Wichita State, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't the name.
No, it was Municipal University of Wichita at that time.
So that period that you're talking about in the 50s is kind of the peak time for oil production in the state, really one of the peak times for exploration. Things must have really been going gung-ho back in that time.
Well, at that time, my world was that little strip there, fairly close to home, through Kingman, Harper, and Barber County down there, and the majority of the leases in that area were with the major companies. Now, the major companies were making a lot of farmhouse independents, Mull, Pickerel. Companies like this that they drilled a lot of wells down there, and there were a lot of big rigs running down there. Came up out of Oklahoma. One of the rigs that I was hauling water to was a Harry Bass Drilling Company out of Fort Worth. That was the Bass family's rig. They were drilling for Magnolia down there at that time.
Interesting. I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s, and sort of come along at the tail end of that. But there's a little bit, but even then there was still a lot of drilling going on in the state, and every time you would drive someplace at night, you always look out and see drilling rigs somewhere. It was just part of the landscape. That's sort of how I envision that time in the 50s, like that.
Yeah, it depends on where you were in Kansas,
Right.
But most places you could see a lot of rigs for a long ways. From our farm, which was about 3 miles north of Spivey, and during the time that I was in high school, they were drilling south of Spivey, but we could see 5 or 6 rigs running just from the lights from those at night. You could see them.
So you went to Wichita, we'll call it Wichita State, and you graduated with a degree in geology. Do you immediately were you working then during that time?
I was very fortunate to get this job with Musgrove. It was really like having a 4-year apprenticeship. They had like 8 rigs running at that time, and they were drilling on Central Kansas Uplift, and a lot in southwest Kansas. They had a rig running in Oklahoma. They were drilling for Panhandle Eastern in southwest Kansas. So the summer between my freshman and sophomore year, they sent me to the field to roughneck on one of their rigs, and it was out in the Elkhart area out there. We drilled one well in Texas County, Oklahoma, and then we drilled some wells in the Greenwood field. So I got some pretty good, I don't know whether experience is the right word or not, but it was, saw a lot of.
But experience as a roughneck and not setting wells then?
Oh no, that was just as a roughneck. But another thing that it was working with the geologists. They had like 5 geologists on staff at that time. So the geologists like to teach young guys something, and
Sure.
And I was eager to learn, and it was a great learning environment. There, also during that time was when the FPC had control of all of the gas wells and everything, and they were drilling some gas wells that you had to go have the hearings on. So that's where I was introduced to the Corporation Commission at that time, because these hearings, they'd have to have exhibits made. And I was actually hired not only just as an errand boy, but also as a draftsman. And so I was drafting the posters and exhibits and maps and such that they would use at the hearings. So I'd get to sit through these hearings at that time. And their attorneys at that time were Bob Martin, who was kind of a famous attorney, Bill Shell, another one in that firm, and George Collins, which was one of the really pioneers of in the oil business legal part of it. So a lot of experience just working with these people. Musgrove was also drilling in Michigan at that time. They were drilling the Niagaran Reef up there.
So when do you sort of begin the transition from those kinds of roughneck drafting duties to a full-fledged geologist sitting on wells?
Well, actually not the sitting on the wells until I had a degree.
Okay.
But I went out with the geologist on, summer vacations, and I say summer vacations. Anytime there was a break in school, I'd go out with the geologist. They always had a geologist out on a well,
Right.
so I'd go out with them. So I got a lot of experience just doing that at that time. I wasn't the only one at Wichita State at that time that was going through the same thing. We're talking about Bob Walters there earlier. Walters Drilling, Don Beecham was there. He was a contemporary, and he was working for them as a geotech, I guess is what we'd call them now. A number of us that got jobs when we graduated, we got jobs because we had been working as a geotech. The ones that didn't went to work for Boeing.
So it was almost like you had an internship and then you moved from an internship.
Exactly.
I'm trying to figure out the way to ask this question. I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe you can help me with the answer. What was that? What was that like at that time? I mean, I just have this vision of oil and gas business was really active. I mean, it was just going to town. How did that feel? I can't think of a better way to articulate this question.
For a farm boy, it was a big deal.
Well, I bet. I mean, but how so? Was it exciting?
Exciting, yeah.
In terms of money you were making or places you were
going?
going?
Not the money I was making. I was working for $1.25 an hour, which that was certainly help.
Right.
And my first job as a full-fledged geologist was for $450 a month.
But in terms of sort of the excitement around the amount of work that was going on and all the wells that were being drilled, and some of them, I assume, were pretty good wells back in those days.
Yeah.
That all must have been pretty exciting, right?
It was very exciting. It still is.
Well, we'll get closer to the present in a second. So in the 60s, you're really working for another company.
Yes.
And I assume just piling up more experience, mostly in Kansas in that process, or?
The first wells I watched were in Kansas, Kingman County, Barber County, and in the Forest City Basin.
Okay.
Musgrove was developing the John Creek Pool, extension to the south of the John Creek Pool in Morris County. And that pool was discovered on surface geology. And there was surface geology that showed a little closer to the south part of the John Creek Pool. And Earl Knighton had brought Musgrove, the prospect in there, and they drilled about 6 wells in there. They extended the field to the south, and the first wells that I went out on were up there in the Forest City Basin.
Pretty different environment than southwestern Kansas or south central Kansas,
yes,
whatever you want to call it.
And then Musgrove had taken a deal. This was after the Yegi Pool discovery up there in
Reno County.
The Gary Riley area.
Up there. Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Continental Oil Company had a big block up in Gage County, Nebraska, just across the line from Kansas up there, on the Salina Basin side of the Nemaha Ridge, and they were looking for pinch out of the hunting up there. And Musgrove took that deal, a farm out from them, as Musgrove and Beardmore, and they sent me up there to watch that well. With the closest control, there was a well that had been drilled on the Nemaha Ridge, but it hit granite at 900 feet.
Some pretty shallow.
That didn't do any good.
Right.
And so we went down into Washington County, Kansas, to find a well that had a full section there. And that was like 20 miles away from where we were drilling up there. And one of the partners didn't want a bronc geologist up there watching that. And Mr. Musgrove said, "Well, do you know anyone that has experience up there?" There wasn't anyone that had experience up there. So I ended up watching 3 wells. They were all dry. We didn't hit the pitch out. The first one had like 200 feet of hunting in it, and we didn't have any shows. But
so you were getting a kind of a variety of experiences.
Yes.
Then during the 60s, in effect,
Yes.
is what's going
Yes.
on. So what provoked you to want to go out on your own?
I got laid off.
Okay, it wasn't provoked. Well, I guess it was provoked, but not by you.
Yeah, no, they really didn't need another geologist when they hired me when I got out of school. But they went ahead and hired me, and they really didn't need, they had enough people with seniority on staff that they didn't need it. So I was put out on my own, but I had watched a lot of wells for them already at that time. And I thought I had enough ideas that I could go ahead and sell some deals and keep an override and get the well setting on it. And I was fortunate to be able to do some of that.
So what part of the world did you focus on when you first started doing it?
More the Kingman, Harper, Barber
Yeah,
County area.
part of the world that you're from.
Yes, and the beautiful part of that was people were drilling in the arch on seismic. Well, seismic really didn't do much good in the strat play and through the Kingman, Harper, Barber area in there. So a little guy had about as good a chance of finding something as the big guys did there. And I was fortunate to be able to sell some deals and get some work.
A couple of things about that. You know, by the time I come along, everybody talks about Kansas as being just independence, and the big companies are all gone. At that time you're talking about, are they still active at that point?
Yeah, the big companies, most of them all had either division or district offices here in Wichita. Gulf, Mobile, it wasn't even Mobile at that time, it was Magnolia, City Service, and you know, through the period of time that I was in school and doing my other work, I met a lot of the people. I went to the KGS meetings and all that, and met a lot of the geologists with the major companies. When the major companies started leaving during the late 60s, early 70s, they started leaving, and that they started making farm outs and really opened up the world for the independents at that time.
Because I tend to associate kind of last vestige of those big companies with the Hugoton and natural gas in southwestern Kansas.
Well, but that was because they had the held by production acreage out there. So that was another era that the majors stayed out there because of their held by production acreage, and the deep rights is another story.
So, and before we go to that, just to back up, you know, you said you basically sort of come back home to the part of the world you were from. Were you putting leases together yourself, or do you have somebody doing that for you?
Some of them I bought myself, but that really was not my area of expertise. And at that time, you could buy most leases for $1 an acre, 10-year
10-year
term, 8th royalty.
Right.
Now, you had to find some place that wasn't already leased, of course. But the majors started dropping their acreage, so there was quite a bit of acreage came open.
Is there, and this is kind of tangential, but was there any advantage to being local when you went in to try to get those kind of leases?
Yeah, there certainly was down there, and I had a local lease broker, Strong's, had bought acreage for a lot of the majors and for a lot of people, and I knew their people, so I had them buy acreage for me and just paid them a commission on it.
Let's go back to that southwestern Kansas. When do you start being active out in that part of the world? Does that come quite a bit later? Or?
That came later. It came with the deep rights legislation.
Let's talk about that a little bit then, because that, just to sort of give you some background, one of the issues that comes up over and over again as we have these conversations about energy in Kansas is the role of the federal government and how when federal government makes policy changes, the impact that it has on everybody, but particularly people, or energy production people. So talk to me a little bit about that change.
Well, actually, we go back to the about 82 or 83, something like that. We had been drilling in the Spivey Grabs area, the Kingman Harbor Barber area, and that was not a whole lot of. It was just kind of corner shooting. We'd find a dry hole that had some good shows, and we'd think we could get to a better spot.
Okay.
And we were drilling those type of deals. The price of oil. Well, I'll back up a little bit further. My oldest son graduated as a geologist from Wichita State. He went 2 years to KU, and then he came back so he could work for me while I was in school. Graduated from Wichita State, and we were continuing to work in that area. We had spread out into Stafford and Pratt County, that area up there. Kevin had worked a lot of deals in that area, or had worked a lot of geology in that area. Okay. And when the price of oil dropped in, here again, I'm a little messed up on my time, but in the early 80s there, the economics of where we were drilling in southern Kansas just didn't work. So I told him, fresh out of school and such, we needed to concentrate on an area where if we found something, it was good. We're looking for 100 barrel a day wells, not 20 barrel a day wells. Mm-hmm. And we looked around for places to go, and you look at Pleasant Prairie and some of the deep production under the Hugoton, and it was good stuff. So I said, just let's work the Hugoton area out there. I said, you can't get any leases, but I think we can get farm outs. I had dealt some with Mobile and Gulf and some of the other majors in south central Kansas. So I knew some of their landmen and knew how to talk their language anyway. So we spent a year. We did not drill a single well. This was in 1986. We did not drill a single well in 86. We had been drilling 10 to 20 wells a year up until that time. And we spent all of our time just basically mapping the shallow beds out there trying to find deep structure. We didn't have any geophysical to go from on it, just looking for the deep structures from the shallow control. And he came up with, we came up with the 10 prospects out there. And of those 10, 8 of them were on Mobile acreage. Of course, Mobile had a tremendous amount of acreage out there. So I had worked some with Mobile. Actually, the first well that McCoy Petroleum drilled was on a Mobile lease that I bought, which was next to our old farm out there. And I called them for a farm out to see, because the deep rights legislation was going on at this time, and the majors were getting afraid they were going to lose their deep rights if they didn't go ahead and do some exploration on it. So I called and he said, well, you're a little too late. We've already farmed that out to a company called Western Gulf. And he said they have to drill a number of wells, and they're behind on drilling what they need to drill on it. They said, why don't you just call them and see if you can get a farm out of the farm out. He said, we know you and we can deal with you. So we called them, and they had sold the deal, or sold an interest in it to a company out of San Francisco, and they got Mobil's seismic along with it. It was mile line seismic that they had done in order to hold the acreage out there to prove that they were doing exploration on it. And they were, it takes a long time to take all that seismic and with, starting off with scratch with it and come up with locations. And they were having a hard time coming up with locations. So I said, well, we have some places out there that we think are drillable right now. And they said, well, we're going to do this. We're not interested in it. Well, a month went by and we called them again, and they said, well, tell us about the locations that you want to drill out there. And I said, well, we're going off the shallow structure, but we think they're good prospects. They said, well, why don't you come out to California and talk to us on it? So we went out to San Francisco, met with them, and we took a chance and took our maps with us. And we showed them our maps, and they said, well, do you think you could get this drilled? I said, yeah, we can get it drilled within the time frame that you have to do it. And I said, do you have it sold? And I said, no, we don't have it sold yet. We won't have any trouble. They turned around and took an interest with us in their own deal. And we hit 3 discoveries on our first 4 wildcats out there.
But these are oil wells.
The 3 were oil, yes. They were. We had a St. Louis well and 2 Morrow gas, 2 Morrow oil wells.
Okay. Do you then start doing a fair amount of drilling for natural gas later on as part of this process of working out there?
We didn't really target natural gas under the Deep Hugon. We found a huge well out there later on. On one of it, we weren't really drilling for gas, but we found it. It had 40 foot of pay in the Morrow, and we had an 11 million drill stem test on it, and open flow on that was 184 million. And we put it online, selling out of both the tubing and the annulus, over 10 million a day. It sold 3 billion cubic feet of gas the first year.
Wow. So, and this is in this period where now they're starting to look at natural gas deregulation. So prices are changing, drilling patterns are changing, the whole world's changing.
Actually, that was during when FERC took over and we had the various tiers, and that was a deep discovery, so we got the high price of gas out.
So you got basically the new price as opposed to the old price.
Yeah. Now all of that was deep, so we didn't have that 104 price or whatever. The held it at basically the price that it had been.
So. Is that really then where your focus is for quite a while at southwestern Kansas? Is that
yes? We ended up getting the farm out directly from Mobil. We renegotiated it, and it was a 10-year deal as long as we kept meeting certain criteria on it, and we had some good discoveries out there, and Later on, we went ahead and worked with the Brexco.
Okay.
They had ends with Amoco and UPRC and several other companies that were getting farm outs from. And we had a joint venture, and together we drilled over 400 wells, deep
Wow.
wells out there during that 10-year period.
So 10-year period, what years are we talking about? From mid-'80s to mid-'90s, is that?
The late 80s and the early 90s.
Okay.
Yeah, middle 90s.
That's a lot of wells. Are you always contracting out your drilling? Or did you own rigs yourself ever?
We didn't own rigs ourselves. We had a Sweetman Drilling, who had done our drilling in south central Kansas,
Okay.
moved his rig out there. He had 2 rigs, and he did our drilling out there. Brexco had their own rigs, Bredco Drilling Company, and they drilled some of our wells. Our deal with them, they drilled on farm outs that they got, and we drilled on farm outs that we received. And it's one of those deals out there when you have a little success, it's a lot easier to work deals with people.
I want to talk about some policy things, but before we do, then you hit a period in the 90s and, I don't know, early 2000s maybe, where 3D seismic comes along, horizontal drilling comes along, the world kind of changes again pretty dramatically. But obviously you were engaged in that world.
Yes.
When did you start using horizontal wells?
Well, we've on the horizontal, we have drilled 2 horizontal wells ourselves. We actually we sold a deal in Harper County about 5 years before the horizontal play started
before it
down
took
there.
off, yeah.
We sold a deal to Abraxas to drill a horizontal well in the Spurgeon-Warsaw band through there.
Okay.
We had drilled some successful gas wells in the Spurgeon-Warsaw. You had to kind of take what you got, because if you frack those wells, you went down into the Osage and got a lot of water.
So let me ask you something about that, because you obviously were real active in that Harper, Barber County area. So when this big Mississippi Line thing blows up, how engaged were you in that, and what did you think of it?
I thought they were crazy when they started out, because they had to handle so much water.
Right,
but
exactly.
They did the infrastructure to be able to handle it and make it work. We had, I'll back up a little bit. In '72, we had leased over 15,000 acres, almost in a solid block in Harper County,
Okay.
for $1 an acre, 10-year leases and such. And we drilled a number of gas wells, some just small little pools that we found. One of these was the Horton pool, or what did they call that? I think it was Horton. We got a well, completed it for 5 million gas, just top setting in the Warsaw there, staying out of the water. And that well and the south offset to it ultimately made over, the first well made $1.5 billion, and the second well made just short of $1 billion. Later on, when they started doing the horizontal, those wells were pretty well depleted at that time, and Sandridge came to us wanted to buy those wells and drill the horizontal in there. I looked it up yesterday that they drilled a well across the same, it's a mile-long horizontal, across that same acreage that had made over 2 billion cubic feet of gas. And that well has made 44,000 barrels of oil and billion to gas additionally, and is still selling about 500,000 gas a day. And we had another little pool to the east of that, and they came in and drilled a 1.5 mile lateral on it. And it has made just short of 3 billion cubic feet of gas and 135,000 barrels of oil. So those wells were very successful. They've got a lot of them down there that weren't successful.
Right.
But some of the stuff was good if they could handle the water. They gave them the big fracks, and they did get down into the Osage, and they had to handle the water to make it work.
And then they created seismic problems that I got to deal with.
Exactly.
But by then, the world is, in terms of leasing rates, are just go completely crazy.
It affected the whole state.
Yeah, up even like up to Colby. I mean, it was nuts, wasn't it?
Yeah. Now we'd gone from the $1 an acre leases to $5 to $10 an acre, and 3 to 5 year terms
Right.
on things. But they came in and they were paying $300 to $1,000 an acre for stuff down there, and it made it to where you couldn't play that country. But the problem is they thought that whole Spurgeon-Warsaw band was going to be good all the way up into Ness County and through there, and they paid that kind of money for leases clear up there, and we're still fighting that.
Well, that even brought temporarily one of the majors back into the state for just a little while. Not very long, but for a little while.
Yeah.
And then it just all kind of
Yeah.
did what you probably figured it was going to do, right?
One of the horizontals work if you've got the right situation. I said we had drilled 2 of them ourselves. This was in Meade County,
Okay.
and it's in the Chester Lime. We had drilled some Chester Lime oil wells in Meade County, and it was a gas solution type reservoir. We didn't make any water, or very little water, and we drilled our first one kind of like Sandridge had drilled. We went next to some wells that had already made a bunch of oil, and that well has made about 110,000 barrels of oil now. Still making about 18 barrels a day. Makes very little water, so our operating costs are low on it. But the cost of drilling the horizontals,
Right.
with the cost of casing and the frac jobs are.
I know in that period you would look at some of the costs on those horizontal wells and then water disposal, and you put it together and just scratch your head and think, what do they know that we don't know, because it doesn't make any sense? Well, it did. A lot of times it didn't make any sense.
Yeah, the way they made it work there in southern Kansas is having the saltwater disposal
They had some
infrastructure.
pipelines where
Yes.
it's to big disposal wells.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm having trouble formulating this question, but when you look at horizontal drilling and 3D seismic, and you go on a rig today and look at it compared to what it must have looked like in the 50s, how does that?
Well,
How does that?
it's hard for us to drill a structural prospect without having 3D on it now. Now some areas it works a lot better than others, but we've done a lot of 3D. And
But it just walking in there and seeing kids running joysticks, and it just must look a little different than when you started out, doesn't it?
well, yes, much different. I mean, the seismic that time when I started out was just all single point, and you got the reflectors and you took your red pencil and you started marking through it and just correlating that way, and then calculating the time on it, and now with the software that we have, it's beautiful.
It's pretty incredible. Isn't
It really is.
Let's talk about policy stuff a little bit, because I know you've been involved at various levels, in that, and obviously have an interest. I mean, a couple things that you deal with. Let's start with, I mean, one of the big lessons, and you put this together for us real well, just dealing with the price fluctuation in the state. Every time you think prices are going to go up and stay up, they figure out a way not to.
That's why it says it's cyclical business, and the problem is the sine curves don't match. Every time the price goes up, then the price of casing goes up, the price of leases go up, everything else goes up, and then if we hit a low spot, that price does not fall at the same rate, which it can't. I mean, I'm not blaming them.
Right.
They've got their costs come into it. If a company has a good base of old paid-for production, well, you can survive. You just shut down spending the money and just maintain what you have, and that's what we've done over the years. It's
You've seen some pretty incredible lows in this process in terms of prices. I mean,
yeah.
You wouldn't have guessed that, or I wouldn't have guessed like it, well, whatever it was in mid 80s that you'd see oil go back, or in the 90s go back down under $10 a barrel.
When we drilled our first well in Spivey, the price of oil was $3 a barrel, but we didn't get $3 a barrel because there was a trucking charge on top of that, so it was around $2.75 or something that we would net. And gas was selling for 12 to 14 cents a thousand cubic feet. We were fortunate in '75, after we had drilled a few wells and after we had purchased some leases that had the old contracts on it, and most of those old contracts were expiring about that time. A lot of them were made they were 20-year contracts made during the 50s. Mm-hmm. So '75 they started expiring, and we were negotiating new contracts. And that's an interesting story in itself, because the KP&L contract in the whole Spivey Grabs area there, which was the big area, and KP&L was the big purchaser in there. It had got up to, it's either 14 or 15 cents a thousand at that time. And that was during the period of time when everybody thought we were going to run out of gas.
Right.
And the Wichita industries, especially Boeing, Beach, Cessna, were worried about what they're going to do for gas supply. So they started the Wichita Industrial Gas Company to go ahead and seek out some gas. And the closest gas to them of any sizable reserves was the Spivey Grabs field. So they came in and started making offers to purchase our gas that had been dedicated to KP&L, and they said they could get a pipeline in there to do it from Wichita. And our original well was, they were offering us $1.80 a thousand, from going from 15 cents to $1.80. And that 15 cents, that was per MCF, not per MMBTU. And the WIEC contract was for 1,000 BTU, so we at least got some increase on it. Maybe it was for 1,200 BTU, I forget now. But at any rate, that gave the impetus for KP&L to go ahead and have to go ahead and be competitive on it. And we got $1.50 out of them, with some escalation clauses in there. And I was talking about this stuff that we drilled earlier in the 70s in the Spurgeon Warsaw Band in Harper County. We signed a contract with People's Natural Gas for 35 cents a thousand down there, which was at that time the highest price that was being paid in Kansas, to my knowledge anyway. but also we were able to negotiate a most favored nations clause and a just and reasonable clause in there, which basically said if anybody else gets paid that for a lifetime contract, we get the same thing. And so we got that similar clauses in the KP&L contract, which was fine and dandy until the Kansas Natural Gas Price Protection Act, which voided that.
And eventually those power companies, and we've talked about this in other interviews, eventually those power companies have to go away from natural gas because everybody's decided we're running out of natural gas. So they all shift to coal in effect, and that market completely changes. What is the regulatory environment like in Kansas? How would you characterize it? And I know that's not a real specific question. But
well, the regulatory from the State Corporation Commission is, I'd classify it very good. This is during my lifetime anyway, it's been a very, they're very cooperative. I don't mean that like they're rolling over for us, because they're not. But they have people that understand the industry. They do their job, and they, compared to other states, Kansas regulatory has been very good.
Let's compare them to other states, because you guys have worked in various other states in this process. So what are the pluses and minuses, or however you want to answer that question, but you know what I mean.
Well, as an example, Colorado is terrible. you can't even think about drilling Colorado now.
Just because of resistance to fossil fuel in general, is that you think the source of that?
Yeah, it just it's just not a good situation there, and we drilled in Texas and Oklahoma. Both of them are okay. I mean, it's different for us because it's not the same procedure, but they're all relatively good. They do their job. They're doing what they were set out to do. And
hey, let me ask you about Kansas severance tax. You were president of Cuyahoga. We were just looking from 84 to 86. Right. Severance tax predates that just a little bit.
Not very much.
Not very much. So you must have been out there active in the business. What do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, our big problem with the severance tax wasn't the fact that we were going to be paying the severance tax. We have the ad valorem tax too, which takes into account the cost of production. I mean, where the well is making a lot of water, there are various factors go into that. The ad valorem tax is probably a pretty fair tax, and I just got, we paid the taxes here on this month's billings, and generally the ad valorem taxes run about 1 month's production. So
really?
of a 12th, pretty much a 12th of whatever we make, I'm talking about net goes to the state on that, or goes to the counties.
Right.
And the severance tax, of course, goes to the state, and it's an added-on tax. I mean, that's just on top. So that was our main problem. You know, they kept saying, well, other states have severance tax. They have a severance tax, but they don't have an ad valorem. Most of them don't have an ad valorem tax based on production. You're paying property tax on the
value,
the hardware, on the surface equipment and all of that. So that was our main problem with it. It's still a problem.
But it has sort of gotten refined over time in terms of what kind of wells it's applied to, and it's not quite as
onerous as it used to be.
As it started, as when it started out, because I don't think anybody wanted to discourage production, but to a certain extent when it first started out, it kind of did.
Well, the selling point on it was, well, the big guys are going to pay that and they'll pass it on. And that here again, they were talking about the big guys in the Hugoton field, mostly owned by the majors, And yeah, they could pass that on, or a lot better than we could. We had no way to pass it on.
They could absorb it easier than you could, and then it doesn't take too long before they're gone
Right.
anyway. Hey, let me ask you sort of another broad question, but I think you're probably in a good position to answer it. So what does the future look like? How does, I mean, and some of these changes, they seem to come along, they're just like horizontal drilling just changes everything. And I don't know very many people that saw that coming,
Right.
or the impact of it, particularly in terms of natural gas.
Right.
I don't know that very many people would have, I didn't know anybody that really predicted that. So if you know stuff like that, you're obviously smarter than everybody else. But you see where I'm getting, I mean, 10, 20, 30 years from now, what'll the Kansas oil business look like? What'll McCoy look like?
Well, probably like eastern Kansas looks now.
You think so?
Well, I mean, it's getting hard to find places to drill. It's the 3D has been, I mean, it was very successful in going into the old areas, and especially on the central Kansas uplift,
Right.
where you could find little small closures that had been passed up, and but a big part of that's been shot by 3D now. So, and northwest Kansas, it's been fairly successful up there.
And I saw you all were active in some of that activity, which that turned into a bigger deal in an area that I don't think most people saw that coming.
You could find that first well with the 3D, but it's awful hard. Most of those pools don't cover a big area. The big pools where you could go in and just keep drilling development wells, it's pretty tough. And a lot of the problems with some of that out there is you get that first well, which is if you stopped right there, you're okay. But you drill about 3 or 4 dry holes around it, and you haven't made any money.
Well, statistically, you always know that you're going to find, if there's something big out there, you find it, and then you just get smaller and smaller over time. Is that how you think this is going to look?
Well, the big strat fields, I think, have been found in Kansas, and that's where you usually get your, and the big structures have been identified.
Right.
So we're looking at smaller and smaller. Here again, it all comes down to the price we're getting for the product. $100 oil, you can drill a lot of things that you can't drill at $50.
Especially if you think prices are going to stay up there for quite a while.
Yeah, and we're optimists. We keep thinking it's all going to get better.
Well, and sometimes it does, and it has been. I mean, I know it's sort of gone up and down here a little bit lately, but it hasn't crashed the way it did a few, 2015, or is it maybe the last time we really saw that kind of
Right.
dramatic drop. Any thoughts about environmental regulation that you've dealt with over years? That world obviously has changed a lot too.
Most environmental regulation, as far as Kansas anyway, it's been all justified. I think I don't have any problem with most of what's going on there.
Hasn't provided any particular challenges that.
Well, the prairie chickens have.
Well, yeah, that's one that comes up from time to time, fairly recently. But in general, you feel like, in terms of on the environmental side, the industry in Kansas has been able to accommodate.
I think the regulations have been pretty fair on that, and for a reason. And most of the companies are very compliant with all of that.
You ever look back and surprise at, you went from being a farm kid into a fairly reasonably sized company.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what question I'm asking, but that must feel kind of gratifying to look back a little bit.
It's very gratifying. Just the people in the business. When I was doing the consulting geology, I did a lot of well setting. Set for a lot of different companies. And at that time, most of my well site work was in western Kansas. And those wells at that time, the geologist would be out there anyway from a week to 2 weeks on the well. Well, you meet a lot of people during that time, and with different companies, you'd meet their production engineers, their field men, and all of that. And I keep going back to an old field man for Barbara Oil Company in Barber County. Barbara Oil Company discovered the Medicine Lodge field in 1926. There was no other production down there. That's the first production in Barber County, and that field's still producing. I mean, these were big gas wells, and in fact, KPNL laid line to them to pick up that gas for 2 or 3 cents a thousand, I think it was, but which they had to get payback for laying all that line. But their production man, when I was watching wells for him during the 60s, was kind of the name of Punch Bowman, and he had worked on that first well down there in the 20s. He was an old man, but he was still doing work for him, and just sitting there. You have a lot of time sitting in the trailer house or the dog house and just listening to these guys talk and talking about all of his experiences with it and everything. And this kind of repeated itself with the production men for all the different companies, and I kind of found out, how they did things and different philosophies. And the same way with the geologist. I watched a lot of wells where major companies had farmed out the land. Well, with those you had to deal with the major company geologist and learned an awful lot from them, just dealing with them. So,
if you go back to 1926, you're talking about almost 100 years of sort of history that you've watched in one way or another over time.
In fact, I did, when I was with Musgrove, they had a prospect in Greenwood County that was based on surface geology, and there was an old division geologist for Gulf Oil Company, retired. I forget how old he was at the time. He had to be in his 80s, but he had done surface work all over Kansas. And they hired him to go out and verify the surface work out there. And I went along just as his rod man. I wasn't really doing anything other than, he had the old plane table and alidade out there and was doing all of this. But just working with these guys like this. He was out there, he'd been in World War I and had on his wool
the pants, the flare out, that job perfect.
They had the chaps on, because we were walking in the tall grass over there. It was just a pleasure to work with some of these old people like that. And now I are one.
Well, it's better than not being
That's
one.
Right.
Anything else I'd ask you before we finish up? I get a kick out of listening to those kind of stories because you don't hear them as often.
We were talking about the majors leaving. The majors leaving left a lot of. There were several steps in this. The independents were able to take farm outs for one thing, but another was they started selling production, and that's one thing that benefited. My company was able to buy production from the major companies, and with the price, I'm not taking big credit for that because price appreciation. If you bought it when the price was $10 and the price went to $20, you were a lot smarter than when it went the other way.
So yeah, you were going through all of that transition as those folks, in effect, because I remember when I first started the survey in '78, a lot of those places still had offices out in southwestern Kansas, and then slowly over time, they just go away. Yeah. Well, thank you for the chance to visit here today. This is a good way to spend a winter afternoon,
Yeah.
it seems like to me. So thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you.